Hello, this is Dr. Nilsson, and today we're going to be discussing fungi or fungi, depending on what part of the world you live in, evolution and diversity. So there are over 100,000 species of fungi or fungi. And what's important to know about fungi is even though they look kind of like plants, they don't move around, and they live in the soil, they are not plants. So fungi are a eukaryotic organism. They can be unicellular, but the majority of them are multicellular, and they are heterotrophic. So they cannot make their own food. They must consume nutrients from their environment. Specifically, they're called saprotrophs. And what saprotrophs are organisms that release digestive enzymes that break down the food, and then they absorb these simpler molecules. So they have external digestion. They can't digest anything within themselves. They have to digest nutrients on the outside and then absorb those molecules into their body. Fungi, even though we often picture them with plants, they are actually more closely related to animals than plants. So what that means is that fungi and animals shared a more recent common ancestor than fungi and plants or animals and plants. There are also some other similarities with animals. We already talked about them being heterotrophic, so that they require nutrients from their environment to live. They also actually store their excess energy as glycogen, similar to animals. And even though they have cells that don't move like plants and cell walls, these cell walls are actually made out of a different substance than plants. Plant cell walls are made out of cellulose. Fungal cell walls are made out of a compound called chitin. And one thing that is kind of similar to plants is that fungi they reproduce either asexually or sexually, and they do this via spores. So fungi play a very important roles in our ecosystems. One of them is that they're decomposers. So what they do is they break down organic material, dead material, and they recycle these materials back into the ecosystem. So if it wasn't for fungi breaking down dead things, the world probably wouldn't look and smell as nice as it does. They're also important for soil building. This is especially the case with lichens, which are actually a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae, which is a protist, or a fungus and a cyanobacteria. Lichens are very, very good at soil building. So they will dissolve bits of rocks and minerals. And over time, what this results is the formation of soil. So fungi, they get rid of organic dead things and recycle the organic matter and keep these nutrients cycling through the ecosystem. They make soil, and they also have different types of symbiotic relationships with other organisms. I just mentioned lichen, but what we'll see today is a variety of other different types of symbiosis. Some of them are parasitic, some of them are mutualistic, which means both organisms benefit. But these are all very important interactions. We also use fungi a lot to produce things that we need. You may be aware that the first antibiotics were isolated from a fungus, a mold, penicillin. We also use fungi to produce other types of useful chemicals. One type of fungi, yeast, is used in the production of alcohol. That's brewer's yeast, so we use that to make wine and beer. Baker's yeast is used to make baked goods, so we wouldn't have any nice breads or leavened baked goods if it wasn't for this single cellular yeast. And then different types of molds are also used in cheese production. It's also important to note that some fungi, though, produce different types of toxins that can poison people if they contaminate the food supply, and there have been some different types of outbreaks of this. Aflatoxin, you may have heard of. These different types of fungi can grow on grains and other plant material. They can make people sick, they can make livestock sick. And of course, you're probably aware of the different types of poisonous mushrooms, why you were always told never to eat mushrooms out in the wild. So I have an example here, the death cap mushroom, which is one of the most toxic mushrooms in the world. So I mentioned that one of the reasons that fungi are important is that they form different types of symbiotic relationships with other organisms. So what symbiosis means is living together, okay? So we sometimes think symbiotic means it's always going to benefit both organisms. That's not necessarily the case. So symbiosis just means living together, and then we have to further define the relationship as to whether it benefits both organisms or benefits one at the detriment of another. So one way that fungi form symbiotic relationships is through parasitism. So this is when the fungus is going to benefit and it's going to harm another organism, the host. So one way that fungi do this is a very common problem with plants, is that they will actually infect the host and they will absorb nutrients from that host and not give any benefit back to this host. One example is corn smut. So this causes losses in the corn industry. This is a fungus that grows on corn. It ruins the kernel. This is actually edible though, and in some parts of Latin America, especially Mexico, this is actually, it's consumed. It's called a corn truffle. Here are some other different types of fungal diseases in plants. We have this fungus on tar spot on maple leaves. Ergo on rye. You're going to learn more about ergo when you do your lab on Tuesday. The fungi can also be parasites to animals. Most of you will probably are aware, or will be shortly, from Dr. Butterworth about white-nosed syndrome in bats. So this is a type of fungus that infects bats. It grows on their faces and it actually wakes them up during hibernization, when they are hibernating, and it causes many of them to starve to death. We, as humans, also have different types of fungal parasites as well. Thrush, which babies get, it's a yeast infection of the mouth. Many women get yeast infections. Other types of fungal infections include things like ringworm and athlete's foot. Okay, so there's a variety of ways that fungi can act as parasites. There are some videos on Canvas I want you to watch to explore more of this. There's a parasitic fungi video that talks about how these different fungi called cordyceps fungi actually can parasitize different types of insect species. It's a really neat video, and please watch that, and that is examinable. And there's also a video on Canvas on white nose syndrome in bats. Now, it's not all bad. So sometimes fungi form symbiotic relationships that benefit both partners, and these types of relationships are called mutualisms. So when a fungus forms a mutualism, this is usually with plants, but there are some examples of animal fungal mutualisms as well. The fungus absorbs nutrients from the host, but also reciprocates in some way. So one example of an animal fungal mutualism is that termites actually have different types of fungi that grow inside them, and it helps provide these fungi secrete enzymes that help them digest wood. So the fungus gets nutrition, but it also provides a service to the animal in helping the animal get nutrition as well. In plants, many plant species have fungal associations called mycorrhizae. These are fungi that can either grow around the root or actually grow into the root and infect the root. And what these fungi do is they help the plant absorb more water and more nutrients, and in exchange, the plant shares some of their sugars with them. So the fungi get a source of food, and they help the plant to have a larger root system and absorb essentially a larger root system to increase the amount of surface area that the plant can use to absorb water and nutrients. One example of a mycorrhizal association that you might be familiar with is the black truffle. So black truffles are a kind of fungus, it's a delicacy, and these are actually a type of mycorrhizal association between a fungus and oak and beech trees. So these truffles help the plant to absorb different types of nutrients and water, but they also have another function, and they will secrete chemicals that inhibit the growth of neighboring plants. This is called allelopathy, and it helps prevent competition of that plant with other types of plants. I have another example on Canvas, a video of a fungi ant mutualism. These are the leafcutter ants, and this is a really, really cool example of a fungi animal mutualism. So please watch that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how fungi are structured. So the fungi can actually be single cellular or multicellular. The majority of fungi are going to be multicellular. And what it consists of is a network of filaments, and these filaments are called hyphae. And the network together is called the mycelium. Okay, so a mycelium is composed of hyphae, network, and the filaments. And the morphology of having these fine filaments, this broad network, that structure is really important for the function, because remember that fungi have to absorb nutrients from their environment. So they need a lot of surface area. So they need to have these fine filaments that have a lot of surface area so that they can enhance their ability to absorb nutrients. These thin hyphae also allow the fungus to penetrate different types of food sources. And then our other type of structure that we see with yeast is this with fungi, or the single cellular yeast. So these are single cellular eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so many of you, when you think of a fungus, you probably picture a mushroom in your head. And what a mushroom actually is just one portion of the fungus. So the vast majority of the fungus consists of these thin hyphae, these filaments, this mycelium that is found underground. And what the mushroom is the reproductive structure. We call it the fruiting body, or the reproductive structure of the fungus. And what the function of the fruiting body is to produce the spores. And the fruiting body helps increase the dispersal of those spores into the environment. So spores in fungi are usually haploid, similar to plants, but there are some examples of fungi that actually can produce diploid spores, which would undergo meiosis to produce haploid mycelium. So here is a picture showing a mushroom. So again, this is the reproductive structure, or the fruiting body of the mushroom. And here is the mycelium. So there are certain hyphae within the fruiting body are going to go on to produce the spores, which will then be primarily dispersed by wind, though some fungi actually have water dispersed spores as well. And again, this vast network, this mycelium of filaments, is what is going to make up the majority of the fungus and serve the absorptive function of the fungus. Okay, so the way that fungi reproduce is they do it either sexually or asexually, or both. They produce trillions of spores. So spores are reproductive cells. They are usually haploid, though they are sometimes diploid. And the different fungi have different life cycles. I do not expect you to learn all the different life cycles of fungi. So I'm going to tell you that right now. There are multiple life cycles described in your textbook. You don't need to learn them all. You just need to have a general idea of how fungi reproduce. So all these life cycles are going to vary in how long the different generations last, and they can how prolific the diploid, the haploid, and what's called the dikaryotic phases are. So you know what a haploid phase is. So haploid is when a cell only has one copy of each chromosome. What we see with fungi, that at least with terrestrial fungi, is that these haploid hyphae can fuse together, okay? And the nuclei don't fuse, you just have the fusion of the cytoplasm. And these are called dikaryotic hyphae. So they have separate nuclei that are each haploid. And then what happens is these can persist for a long time, these dikaryotic hyphae. They can grow for years and years and years. And then at some point, these nuclei will fuse together. So you'll have a fusion of the two nuclei to form a diploid zygote. That too can last for a while, or it might immediately undergo meiosis to form haploid hyphae again. Okay? So the time and the persistence of these different forms, the haploid, the dikaryotic, and the diploid form, really vary between the different types of fungi. Okay, so this is just a generalized life cycle of a fungus, okay? As you can see, we have 3 different forms the fungus can exist in. Haploid, dikaryotic, so fused cytoplasm, fused hyphae, but unfused nuclei from different parents, and then the fused nuclei diploid form. Fungi can reproduce sexually, they can reproduce asexually. What we see is that the majority of the time, the mycelium and the body of the fungus is going to either be haploid or dikaryotic. Okay? So let's talk about asexual reproduction first. This is the simplest. So you have mycelium, that's haploid, which will have certain types of mycelium will end up producing spores, which are haploid. Those spores will get dispersed into the environment either by wind or water, and they'll germinate to produce additional haploid hyphae. Okay? Now, with sexual reproduction, this is going to vary a little bit between the different types of fungi, but what we have is haploid mycelium. What will occur is you have that fusion, right? So you have these different mating types will actually fuse together, and the cytoplasm will fuse first and can persist for a while in that dikaryotic phase. And then eventually in some portions of the fungi, in terms of mushrooms, that's where this is going to occur in the fruiting body. Those mycelia are going to fuse, and the nuclei are going to come together to form a zygote, and that's going to be diploid. It can exist, some fungi, this might exist as a diploid form for a while, or this zygote might immediately undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores, which will then be dispersed out into the environment, grow via mitosis into additional mycelia. Okay? So this is the very generalized view of a fungal life cycle, and this is all I expect you to know in terms of life cycle. Okay, so the phylogeny of fungi is still being worked out. So for a long time, it was thought that there were only 5 phyla of fungi, but with all the new sequence data that's out now, a lot of the phylogenies are getting moved around a little bit. So now, based on the current data that we have, fungi are differentiated into 6 different phyla. And this is done according to their life cycle and the type of structures that they use to produce their spores, and also sequence data. So this first lineage here, called Microsporidia, was actually first thought to be a protist for a long time, and it was only until DNA sequence data came out that it was determined that it was really a fungus and not a protist. And then we have the chytrids, the zygospore fungi. This group here is still being worked out, so this might change even in the next decade or so. And then we kind of have the traditional fungal groups that are probably going to stay where they are. The glimmermycota, which are also called the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Ascomycota are sac fungi, and basidiomycota, which are the club fungi. Okay, this chart here summarizes the key features, the different types of reproduction that they have, and a few examples of it. So you want to be familiar with the key features. The intricacies of the life cycle, again, is not examinable, but you need to kind of have an idea of, what these fungi look like. Are they unicellular? Are they multicellular? Are they mushroom-like in appearance? Are they mold-like in appearance? And so on. So we're going to go through each of these groups now so you get a little more information about them. Okay, so let's start with the microsporidians. So these are this is the phyla of organisms that was once thought to be protists, okay? And really only in the last decade or so that this got moved around a bit. So you might actually, if you do searches on the internet, you still might find old figures that consider microsporidians as protists. So what microsporidians are is they're single-celled fungi and they're parasitic, okay? So they're obligate intracellular animal parasites. So they have to live within a host. And they pose a problem in humans. So this is an example. This is called E. caniculi, and this is a microsporidium that can infect people with AIDS and people that are taking medication that reduce their immune system. So patients that are undergoing chemotherapy or maybe that are taking anti-rejection medication. And what these fungi do is they infect a host with spores. And so here is a picture of a host cell. This is a vacuole of a host cell, and these are the microsporidial spores growing within the vacuole. Okay, so they can grow in there, and then they can affect metabolism and other things and make people very, very sick. Okay, the next group are the chytrids, and this is an interesting group of aquatic fungi. So there's about 750 species of this fungi. Some are singular cellular, but most of them are multicellular, and they have branched hyphae. And they're unique from the other fungi for a few reasons. One is that they still have flagellated cells. So they have flagella. They live in aquatic environments or very, very moist soil. So they require moist environments. And they live in aquatic environments where they are important decomposers of the ecosystem. They usually reproduce asexually through the production of flagellated spores, which can disperse off into the water and divide by mitosis to form additional hyphae. So one example of a parasitic chytrid is this chytrid here. It's infecting frogs and other amphibians right now. You can see that it infects the cells and it produces these tumor-like structures on the amphibians. So these chytrids are causing a major problem. Amphibians are already having major declines due to different types of contaminants in their environment, but this is another pressure that amphibians are facing, and it's causing major losses in amphibian biodiversity. There's research now to try to expose tadpoles to antifungal agents to prevent the infection at the tadpole stage. Okay, so let's move on to the zygospore fungi. This is the phyla that's still kind of being worked out. And the most familiar member of the zygospore fungi are going to be the black bread mold. So this is the mold that you see on bread. This is the mold you're gonna find on your fruit if you let it sit too long. This includes about 1,000 species. And it's unique because it produces haploid spores, but also diploid spores called zygospores. And then these zygospores get released into the environment, undergo meiosis, and form additional hyphae. These are mainly saprotrophs, so they are going to absorb nutrients from their environment. They're not going to parasitize animals or have a mutualistic association with plants. So they mainly secrete enzymes into their environment and then absorb them. There is a life cycle listed in your book. Again, those details are not examinable. Okay, next up is going to be glomeromycota. The other name for this are the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And these are a really cool group of fungi because they are going to be a mutualistic group. So these fungi group of about 230 species are going to form mutualistic associations with plant species. They form these structures called arbusculars. So it's called arbuscular. It kind of looks like a tree, these tree-like branching structures. These are going to actually infect and grow into the plant. And they'll grow into plant cells, though they're not going to penetrate the cell membrane. They kind of like grow in and push the membrane out of the way. So they form these arbuscular structures in the plant, within the plant, and they are going to get carbon from the plant. So they'll feed off that plant-produced carbon, but they're going to act as an extension of the root system. So you're going to have all these fungal hyphae that are going to be able to absorb water and absorb nutrients from the environment and provide it to the plant. And farmers will actually inoculate their fields with this type of fungus because it improves crop productivity by increasing the size of the root system. Another interesting thing about these fungi is they can actually link different plants together. So it's been shown that different plants can actually share carbon, and different types of signaling molecules like hormones can move between the plants by this arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal network. So there's a lot of research right now looking at how these different types of fungi actually contribute to plant-plant communication. Okay, next up are the Ascomycota. The Ascomycota are called sac fungi. There are about 64,000 species, so this is the second, or actually this might be the largest group of fungi. Most of these are going to be saprotrophs, so they are going to absorb molecules from their environment that they have digested externally. And this group has a lot of fungi that are very good at digesting really, really tough molecules like cellulose, lignin, and collagen. So this group of fungi are going to be very important decomposers and important for nutrient cycling in ecosystems. This group is going to include molds, yeast, here's yeast here, unicellular yeast, and certain types of mushrooms, including morels, which grow around here in our woods in Pennsylvania, and truffles, which are, you associate with Europe. But these are two types of culinary mushrooms in Ascomycota. This group of fungi reproduce both asexually and sexually. So what I have here are two examples of asexual reproduction in this phyla. So we have yeast. Yeast reproduce asexually by budding. So they'll actually just kind of, you'll have a pinching off of part of the cell and form a new cell that is, of course, identical to the parent cell. Another way that Ascomycota, the majority of them reproduce asexually, is through asexual spores. So here's a structure on a mold, and it forms at the tips of the hyphae here. It'll form these structures called conidii, and these conidii will have spores on them that will be released into the air. So that's two ways that Ascomycota can reproduce asexually. They also can reproduce sexually. So this is going to occur in the fruiting body. Again, the structure, when you think of a fungus, you say, oh, a fungus, a mushroom. The fruiting body is going to be the site of sexual reproduction. And the sac fungi are going to produce structures called asci. These asci are finger-like structures that are going to be found in the fruiting body. And this is where those dikaryotic hyphae are going to fuse together to form a zygote, okay? So this is where the nuclei are going to come together to form a diploid nuclei. The diploid nuclei of the zygote will then undergo meiosis to produce spores. And these spores will form in these asci. So these are called ascospores. You can see how they're finger-like in structure here. And these will release spores to their environment. And remember, the fruiting body is important because it's going to be above ground. It's going to be exposed to water. It's going to be exposed to air. And it's going to allow these spores to get off of the parent and get into the environment better. Okay. So a few uses of Ascomycota. Neurospora is a mold, and this was a very, very important model organism. The one gene, one enzyme hypothesis was actually done based on studies in this organism. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, this is a yeast, and it's an important model organism as well. It's singular cellular yeast, but it's a eukaryote. So it's used in a lot of lab studies because it's really easy to work with, it's easy to transform, and a lot of medical discoveries, had work that was done on this model organism. We talked about morels and truffles. These are two edible mushrooms in Ascomycota. There are a number of different plant diseases that are Ascomycota as well. Powdery mildew, leaf curl fungi, chestnut blight, and Dutch elm disease. These are two diseases that have really affected some of our native trees in Pennsylvania. And ergo of rye, which is a disease that you'll learn more about in your lab. And then some of our infectious fungi, so athlete's foot, ringworm, thrush, these are also caused by fungi in Ascomycota. And then penicillin and cyclosporin, these are two medications that are actually produced by Ascomycota fungi. Okay, the last phyla of fungi we're going to talk about are the Basidiomycota. These are called the club fungi. So the other group was the sac fungi. These are going to be the club fungi. There's about 31,000 species of these, and the majority of the fungi you encounter out in the woods are going to be Basidiomycota. So these are going to include things like the shelf fungus, normal kind of looking mushrooms, including like some of our edible mushrooms like portobello, but also some of the very highly toxic mushrooms such as the death cap mushroom. Puffballs, you may have played around with these as a kid. They're these circular balls, and when you squeeze them, the spores will come out. This is a neat fungus called bird's nest fungus, and this is called a stinkhorn. Every once in a while you can find these where we are. They almost look like a finger that's sticking up from the ground. They're very smelly. Sometimes they're even like flesh colored or red, and they look really creepy, but they actually attract insects to them that the spores will stick to, and it'll actually aid in dispersal of the spores. So the reason that club fungi are called club fungi has to do with how the structures that they form for sexual reproduction. So club fungi are going to reproduce primarily by sexual reproduction, and again, this is going to occur in the fruiting body or the mushroom. They're also, in this case, they're going to be called the basidiocarps. And the basidiocarps are going to contain club-shaped structures. That's where the name club fungi comes from, that are called basidium. So if you see a gilled mushroom, these basidiums are going to be present in the gills. If it's something like a shelf fungus, these will be present in tubes within the fungus, or membranes, which is the case of like the puffball mushrooms. So these basidiums are going to be club-shaped structures, and this is where the nuclear fusion is going to occur. So you're going to have that dikaryotic hyphae. At some point, we get the fusion of those nuclei to produce the zygote. This is going to happen in the basidium, which will then undergo meiosis to produce spores, which will then get dispersed out through the wind. So one way So while not all of the club fungi have gills, all the gilled mushrooms will be club fungi. So that's a good way to, if you see a fungus growing out in the woods and you see that it has gills, you'll know that it's a member of the club fungi. Okay, finally, I want to talk about lichens. So we are going to be doing a whole lab on lichens. So what a lichen is a symbiotic association between a photosynthetic microorganism, either a green algae, which is a protist. So green algae are eukaryotes, so they're eukaryotic cells, but they're single cellular in this case. Not always single cellular, but usually with lichens they are. Or a cyanobacteria, which is a prokaryote. Both are photosynthetic. So it's a photosynthetic microorganism and a fungus, okay? And what happens is the algae, the protist or the cyanobacteria, is actually going to provide carbon or organic nitrogen to the fungus. And the fungus is going to provide an environment for that organism to grow in, and it's also going to determine the form of the lichen. And we describe 3 different types of lichen. So we have crustose lichen. You've probably seen these growing on walls, on rocks, tombstones. So it's a very kind of shallow lichen. It encrusts a layered-like structure. We also have a foliose or a leaf-like lichen. So it looks more like a leaf that grows on trees, branches. Sometimes you see these also growing on rocks. And then there's fruticose lichens, which are shrub-like lichens that are really kind of puffy and branched. And there's actually even more different types, not really where we are, but there's some lichens that look like trumpets and that are just a lot puffier and more unique than what we really see around our neck of the woods. So here's an example. This is an SEM showing the fungal hyphae that are encapsulating this algal cell. Okay. So for a long time, it was thought that lichens were a mutualism, that the lichen was the fungus providing a home for the algae, and the algae in exchange for lodging was providing the fungus with nutrients. So you had these specialized fungal hyphae that are going to penetrate and surround the algae cell or the cyanobacteria cell. And then these nutrients are transferred by the hyphae directly to the fungus. Now, some of these lichens may actually be mutualistic, but recent research has suggested that it's actually probably parasitism, that the fungus is parasitizing the photosynthetic part of the symbiont. And the reason why this is thought to be the case now is that scientists have done experiments where they've separated out the algae or the cyanobacteria from the fungus. And what they found is that the photosynthetic cell, the algae or the cyanobacteria, actually does better when it's not encapsulated by the fungus. So it has a higher growth rate and a higher rate of reproduction than it does in the lichen. And the fungal symbiont, so the fungus usually can't grow by itself. So for years we thought this was a mutualistic relationship, but what we're finding now is that it's probably more a case of controlled parasitism. So why are lichens important? So one of the most important things that lichens do is that they are soil builders. So they're able to grow on rocks, and the fungus will secrete different types of enzymes that are going to break down the rock a little bit. They'll trap bits of soil, and they're just soil builders, right? So they can start growing in areas where there's no soil, no plants, such as when a glacier recedes an area, and they can start putting organic material into the environment and breaking down the rock into smaller bits, making the soil that will facilitate the mosses and the liverworts and some of those basal plants to start colonizing that area. So they're very important pioneer species. Another thing that lichens, another important aspect of lichens is that they actually have many different types of antibiotic properties. It's thought that these lichens secrete different types of antibiotics, to prevent colonization from, other types of bacteria. So there's a lot of people working to isolate some of these antibiotic compounds from different lichens. And finally, what we're going to explore in depth in lab is we're going to see how lichens can be used to measure air quality. So lichens are extremely sensitive to pollution because they're going to get all the nutrients, including the water, from the air. So the fungus is going to absorb the nutrients from particles in the air and from water vapor. So when the air is highly polluted, it can inhibit lichen growth or even kill lichens, and they are essentially a bioindicating species. So they are an organism that can tell us about the abiotic environment by their presence or absence or their amount of growth. So we are going to be using lichens in the woods surrounding campus. We're going to be monitoring them. We're going to be looking at abundance and the type of lichen in order to get an estimate of the quality of the air around our campus. So that's what we're going to be working on Tuesday. Make sure you read your lab in advance and make sure you dress appropriately for lab. We are going to be going out in the woods, including off trip. Okay, that's all for now. If you have any questions, please bring them to lab or bring them to my office hours. Thank you.